Going to begin though with the Mike Budenholzer news for the Milwaukee Bucks. They dismissed him. That was the phrasing, which I thought was fairly interesting under the circumstances. Normally, it could be they've decided to part ways, but I guess because he was still under contract and given the extension that he had signed, they're taking. I think he was signed through 2024, 2025, if I wasn't mistaken. So it had to be a dismissal. Maybe that's why it's phrased that way. I want to make this clear because I feel like Bucks fans gave me pushback on Twitter, and I would like them to watch this segment or listen to it in its entirety. I don't I understand why you make this move, that it was just time for a change. You only reached the Eastern Conference Finals twice in 5 years. You did win one championship, but you have the best player in the NBA, no worse than the second or third best player in the NBA. I understand why you make this move. I also understand one, the timing is just poor. His brother passed away right before game one due to he died in a car accident or died from complications from the car accident. The optics of that make it terrible, which would lead me to believe that the Bucks, even though they're supposed to have an extensive search per Woj, they have their guy in mind. Maybe it's Nick Nurse, maybe it's someone else, but this doesn't feel like a move you make now unless you know who you want to replace Budenholzer. And I think it's fine to say that this team needed fresh perspective. Yes, Coach Bud did a good job of kind of overhauling the culture there, but maybe you believe that he's reached his peak with this roster, that they just need. I hate saying that they lost the locker room, and the Bucks didn't seem like a team where he lost the locker room, but maybe you just wanted that new, fresh voice in there. Maybe someone who was going to branch out and try a little bit more creative stuff on offense. I think all of that is fine. My main, I wouldn't even call it issue or even a qualm here, is just, and I just don't agree with the decision, or I think that let's phrase it this way. Bud is essentially the fall guy because the roster, I believe, was more so the problem. And the Bucks have very few other ways to shake up the franchise right now. You're heading into an offseason where, depending on what you have to pay Brook Lopez, going to be a free agent. Chris Middleton has that player option, so maybe he ends up on the books for less. But if he does just pick up that player option, he's on the books for a crap ton of money. If he signs a new deal, he's still probably on the books for a crap ton of money overall. And the new CBA rules make it not just prohibitive, but impossible to make certain changes if you are about $17.5 million over the luxury tax apron. The Bucks, if they keep this roster firmly intact, are going to be there. That means no mini MLE. That means that they can't trade a draft pick that's 7 years out. They could still trade a draft pick. They could trade 2029. And the other thing here is that you can't, I find this fascinating and incredibly limiting. You can't decrease your salaries as part of an aggregate trade. Let's just say they were willing to trade, just throw numbers out here, $25 million in salary from two players for one $17 million player. You can't do that, apparently. So that restricts them even further. And there are just some other restrictions in there, but those are really just the big ones. What are they supposed to do? What changes are they supposed to make? You're almost locked into saying, hey, will Joe Ingles come back for 120% of his salary this year, non-bird rights? Maybe, Jay Crowder didn't really play, and his exit interview was either illuminating and uncomfortable. You have his bird rights. Are you willing to pay him enough so that he sticks around? You promise him a bigger role with a new coach. There's very few things that you can do with this roster. Yes, you could still go ahead and make moves, but your assets are, what does Marjon Beauchamp, a 2029 first round pick, and then salary get you? Who does that get you? And the names out there, like we've been through this exercise in the podcast before. I don't know if it's someone who's going to address their biggest issue, which I would argue is they either need kind of a change up at point of attack offense, or they just need wing depth and maybe a little bit in the form of point of attack defense, where like they struggled there in the playoffs at points, even while having Drew Holiday on the roster. I don't know how they're going to address all of that, but you look at this roster, and Jason Maples, for anyone host Temple of Hoop podcast, he was on top of this from the beginning of the season. I picked the Bucks to come out of the East at the beginning of the season and lose in the NBA Finals, but I did pick them to come out of the East. I underestimated. I was concerned about their wing depth specifically, and I even underestimated it. Like, there's just not a ton of athleticism outside of Giannis on this roster. Chris Middleton, after coming back from the second injury, looked pretty slow defensively, even when he had like really bright moments of offense. And it just makes you wonder, what's the path forward? Drew Holiday is 32. Brook Lopez is 35. Giannis still just in absolutely in his prime, so that's fine. You're not worried about him, but like the rest of the roster, Drew going to age 33 season next year, so it'll be age 36 season for Brook Lopez. No, it'll be age 35 for Brook Lopez. Excuse me, he turned 35 after February of this year. Then you have even Chris Middleton. It'll be his age 32 season. Pat Connaughton, whose role was up and down this year, that's going to be his age 31 season. You're not an especially young team. You're very asset light, and now you can't even, unless you cut salary elsewhere. Like maybe you're able to open up flexibility under the apron. You're not even going to have the mini MLE at your disposal. I'm not saying, this is not my way of saying that Bud is perfect. He wasn't. I think there are a lot of decisions that you could question in the playoffs. The uses of the timeout in the final game against timeouts, plural, or non-use of the timeouts against Miami, for sure. Not going to Jay Crowder more, continuing to lean too much maybe on Wesley Matthews. I just don't know. When you look at some of the context over the past 2 years since they've won their title, Chris Middleton out during the postseason last year. Giannis misses and by the way, Chris Middleton misses a huge chunk of this season, and the Bucks still just finished with the NBA's best record. That's incredible still. And I know that the postseason is all that matters. But again, Giannis misses a chunk of game 1 and then games 2 and 3 against Miami because of a back issue. He did not look like Giannis himself when he was back. And the other thing here that you can't attribute to Bud is that Giannis regressed as a jump shooter. And we know that that's never been his game, but like the counters just weren't there like they have been the previous 2 years. The mid-range percentage, I believe, dropped. I haven't looked at it in a while, but it certainly was not a weapon against Miami. You can't attribute all that, to the head coach. And when you're looking at the rest of the personnel, what else were you supposed to do? What adjustments did you want him to make? If you're saying it's, again, you need a fresh voice, or that you really believe, and I don't want to hear about Nick Nurse. He was kind of inflexible in Toronto. They did some creative things, but didn't change up the offense enough to think, when you look at this roster, and look, offense is the problem, I think, because there was a lot of talk about their defense, about the quality of three-pointers they're giving up. This season specifically, when you go back and just kind of look at their ranks throughout the Coach Bud era, is they limited looks at the rim, and then their bag was, hey, we're going to have to just concede three-pointers. That's just something that's going to be caked in to this. So, 2018, 2019, they were 30th in opponent three-point attempt rate. So the share of shots coming from beyond the arc. The year 2019, 2020, they were 28th. 2020, 2021, they're 26th. Last season, they're 29th. This year, they were 5th, while also being 3rd in the share of opponent shots coming at the rim. They found a way, and I think they were definitely more inventive defensively, like not even just this year, but when you look at sort of the title year, since then, they've been willing to try more things when you just watch them. And this year specifically, I think it was super effective for their defense overall. Miami caught fire in the playoffs from 3, which is something they really hadn't done all season. They did see an uptick in shooting from, Max Strus and company after the All-Star break, a little bit after the All-Star break anyway. But like they weren't this caps lock, italics, bold text, hot shooting team. They became one against the Bucks, and a lot of it was contested three-pointers. Like they shot, I can't even remember the number. I'll try and look it up now, but they shot like an astronomical percentage on contested three-pointers. So where a defender is going to be at least, within 2 to 4 feet of your person. Like Miami, even now, like dating into the Knicks series, they're 4th in effective field goal percentage on heavily contested jumpers. And they're shooting for the playoffs. And much of this is, in the Milwaukee Bucks series, they're at 43.6% on contested threes. That's the second best mark in the league among playoff teams. Atlanta was actually 1st through their 6-game set against Boston. Like those are tough shots. And when you look at it, felt like there wasn't enough offensive variability from the Bucks, more so than defense this season specifically. And I think most Bucks fans would agree. I don't know how you get that out of this roster, because I think Giannis Antetokounmpo is the best player in the world. That is just, this postseason didn't change anything about that. There are limitations to his game. It doesn't change anything about that for me. Am I interested in how he ages for a game that's still prided on these long strides and getting by guys and just playing super physical and explosive? Absolutely. Fascinated by it. But I think he's the greatest player in the world right now. You do have to build out your roster in a very specific fashion to account for his limitations, though. It's almost like if you put him on the court with a center who isn't Brook Lopez or even a floor spacing big. But Brook Lopez is the ideal big to have alongside Giannis as a rim protector, someone who stretches the floor but can also work from the outside in. Uh, and there are very few of those guys in the league. And if you don't care about the rim protection, it opens it up a little bit where you could say, oh, Zeke Naji could do that. Karl Anthony Towns, if you're able to get him, which you can't. So I think that matters. And it's if you're not going to have enough either functional shooting, like complementary shooting, where you're having guys like just fly around away from the ball, or in Drew Holiday's case, where it seems like, and this is not a statistical anecdote, but he's a killer shot maker during the regular season. Like he can get the step back work and he can hit ridiculous jumpers without fail. It always seems like those shots fall short for him in the playoffs. Not literally fall short, just that some of them are long and just plain ugly. But they're just not going down at as high a clip. And that's not to say that you need to go ahead and now let's trade Drew Holiday. My point is just that there are, and it's aside from Giannis, is that you don't, there are limitations. There are strictures within which you need to work of this roster that I don't think a new head coach is just going to solve. I'm open to the idea that I'm wrong. I'm not saying this was the incorrect decision. I just truly believe that the Bucks personnel this year and their roster setup in general, I believe that their current roster coupled with all these restrictions they're going to face moving forward was by far the bigger problem than whatever Coach Bud wasn't doing. I really just don't think there were all these threads that he wasn't pulling at that were there for him to explore. And I think he made mistakes. Did he cost them this playoff series? No. These playoff series are not lost by 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 decisions. The Bucks were in that final game. They were in a 3-1 hole that they never should have been in. Is that on Bud? Okay. What else did you want him to do during you won one game without Giannis where you didn't have them prepared for game one? That's been sort of the Bucks MO is that, oh, they lost the game one. All right. So is that on Bud? He's definitely responsible for their failures. But I just don't think that he was even close to the biggest problem there. And I'm open to the idea that I'm wrong. You could hit the YouTube comments with it. And I hope that Bucks fans at least gave me this, 11 or 12 minutes that I spent on this to show that I don't know if this is the right decision. It doesn't feel right to me, or at least I don't think it addresses the biggest issue. And we won't know until they go through the offseason. Maybe they're able to do something that's a little bit more creative that I don't see coming. I would bet against it unless it's a core change of, oh, we're looking to move on from Brook Lopez or Chris Middleton or even Drew Holiday. I don't know that they're going to stumble into anything on the free agent market, or if Joe Ingles comes back and he's going to be playing like gangbusters, or Marjon Beauchamp hits next year, excuse me. They're just so limited in what they can do. And I think that's the bigger problem when looking at how flawed this roster was from an offensive perspective. And I will also say it's a little hypocritical to celebrate what Giannis said after Game 5's loss to Miami about how this season wasn't a failure, and then you fire Bud because it was a failure in your eyes. I think what Giannis said, by the way, on the spot, just to articulate that the way that he did, as my co-host Grant Hughes mentioned, in his second fucking language, no less, but just on the spot, having that answer, incredible. I didn't agree with every aspect of it, but it was an incredible answer. He was lauded for it. The discourse after it was fucking terrible. Not from Giannis, just from everybody who was analyzing it, maybe including this podcast, who knows, but that was fucking awful. But to say that this season wasn't a failure, and I understood what he was saying. I think it was, if you don't want to call it a failure, it was a disappointment, and fans are clearly agreeing if you want Coach Bud to go, but you can't laud Giannis for framing the season in those terms, then get rid of your title winning head coach who only 2 Eastern Conference Finals appearances in 5 years. Like they've run into bears, they've run into injuries. Like these have been this is to say that it's you came up short, especially when you look at like the earlier versions of the roster that they had been working with. I just don't think the resume is unimpressive. I think the past 2 postseasons specifically were eminently excusable. So that's why this just doesn't sit right with me. I'm very interested to see who they replace him with. I would bet that it's going to be a bigger name, like not in the realm of I could see the Lakers kind of went this route when they poached Darvin Ham from Milwaukee, ironically. I'd be fairly shocked if it's a first-time head coach. And I'd be fairly shocked if it's someone who, so Kenny Atkins, I think, would be an interesting fit, but he's known more for his player development than, even though he kind of does the creative stuff offensively. So I'd be surprised with someone like that. Nick Nurse has been the obvious name linked. I don't know that I love him for this team. He'll certainly be willing to play certain guys more minutes than Coach Bud would have. He wasn't afraid to do that in Toronto. But he just, Toronto's supposed to have all these great guys on the roster, and they weren't great this season, and the culture apparently wasn't great there. So I don't know why you would all of a sudden want Nick Nurse. There are other names that are out there. I will be very interested to see who they lean towards next and what names end up being linked to this. The two things I'll just reiterate to close this out. You make this decision when you know who you want after him. And so that's why I'm so curious to see who they pick. And two, I'm just not sure if it's the right decision. And then three, I really don't think it addresses the bigger issue. And so maybe we see shakeups on the roster, and then that'll clue me in where it's like, okay, well, this is more of a total overhaul. And that's the route that they wanted to go.